Good afternoon, everyone. Um, okay. Um, I'll be talking about some of the work that we're doing in the office. Um, some are old, some are new, but we just want to describe how we approach design in the studio. Um, we're how we deal with like site conditions, constraints by uh, uh, a vague building code, clients, and being, critical pragmatists in a way to kind of, with all those constraints, come up with at least a single architectural idea, prevalent in the work, right? Because, projects for me are a kind of opportunities for drawing out ideas on how I think architecture should be, right? Um, and I can mention a few old projects that kind of became catalysts for changing people's perception on architecture. Um, One early project was a restaurant. One of my during my early practices. And at that time, it was pretty cool to have a restaurant, right? So in order for me to actually uh, project the idea of what I want a restaurant to be, I had to be a partner in this restaurant, right? So, and as restaurants are kind of they're always like designed as a thematic space, related to what the cuisine they serve. So, and I didn't want to, go into that route, but instead um, come up with a restaurant that reflected um, experimentation, that also reflected experimentation in food. I met a really incredible chef named Henry Canoy, and he's a guy who he would just come up with like a dish from leftover food in the kitchen, scraps, leftover scraps, not used scraps, but still usable scraps, and I wanted uh, I invited him to join in the restaurant, and the restaurant came out to be a place where um, you know experiments in food can happen. So the space actually reflected that as well. And at School of Design and Arts, winning that competition was also a shock to me initially. Uh, presenting only a model to a board of LaSalle brothers, right, with only one pitch, that the School of Design be a mechanism for teaching design, where students of different art disciplines converge and dialogue in common areas and classrooms that deviated from a 90-degree angle, right? So, and my museum uh, was a kind of project that I won in an interview, having pitched to a board of Fort Bonifacio Art Foundation um, that the Science Museum could be unique from all science museums worldwide if if art can be, you know, um, if art can articulate science, if art can articulate the scientific principles. So it all kind of started from there, right? And the Ayala uh, land actually gave me an incredible freedom to actually design what we wanted there. Okay, most of our projects, almost like 90% are luxury residentials. Um, and sometimes it's a kind of typology that uh, knowing moneyed individuals have very conservative ideas about how a house is designed, right? So it's always a challenge to kind of bring out an idea, a new idea to these guys, except, I met this guy who, you know, who had, a certain budget, but then was so open um, in coming up with a new house typology. So he's like an eye doctor, right? So at that time when I met him, he was like newly married, no kids, but he had an incredible art collection. And he he wanted a house and he wanted all these bedrooms, but then he didn't have any kids yet. So what we did was kind of come up with a house that in the meantime could be a vessel for his art, right? And and this house was kind of arranged in a way that the rooms are kind of in half laps. So, at any point of the house, you're able to see through different spaces because the walls where the enclosed walls are made of glass. So in a way, the rooms were kind of in a way galleries to hold this art. So these sections reveal how open the house is from any vantage point. Okay. This project, which is currently being built, um, is located in Forbes Park, one of the ritziest um, neighborhoods. But the client was pretty open in terms of coming up with a new form, right? With a new idea about what the house is. And unfortunately, this house is located on the periphery of Forbes Park, where it's backing EDSA, right? So we had to kind of devise a way how we can cancel out the noise or block out the noise from from the interior of the house or from the kind of the garden zone of the house. So what we came up with was a sort of a court house where the garden was, instead of being in the rear, was placed in the front, right? And the house was organized around it to block off the sound coming out from EDSA. Um, Currently, we're sort of designing 4 buildings around the Bel Air zone area where you have a commercial strip, Jupiter, Polaris, uh, mostly 'cause it's a strip of commercial establishments. But this zone has become an area where multi-brand and mono-brand stores have been popping up, right? So we have this opportunity to explore different ideas of what this retail typology could be, right? The first is to Jupiter, which is the Kuisen showroom, which is located on Jupiter and Zodiac, right? So this store, it's owned by an old friend. It's a multi-brand store of designer furniture and casework, right? And being at the end of Jupiter, I mean, depending on how you access it, either the end or the beginning, the site is actually not locked by other buildings. It's a sort of a corner condition, and so it was kind of natural for the building to be splayed because the owner wanted sort of a differentiation between brands per level, and so splaying it in the corner was sort of a response to a corner condition, right? That's the existing building now, where each floor is differentiated and could be a mono brand per level, or distinguished as another product category on a different level. Similarly, there's another site, which is the corner of Jupiter and Polaris, which we made a study a few years back, and it's on hold currently. But this was another kind of interesting condition where the street is currently heavy with pedestrian traffic, and it's lined with small restaurants and cafes, right? So what I wanted to do is sort of extend the street along the facade, where you can access any store within any level directly from the street, creating a sort of a vertical street and making that the facade of the building, right? And this other one, located between two buildings, is owned by a liquor owner who sells multi-brand liquor, right? So, and he wanted to just occupy a portion of the building, and he wanted to rent out the other spaces, right? So and being having to respond to limitations of the site and the guidelines, we kind of created studies on how we could articulate the facade, being in a direct western exposure, right? So what we came up with was a sort of a deformed brise-soleil system, which is kind of prevalent in that neighborhood. You have like buildings along that street with the 70s brise-soleil architecture, and deforming this brise-soleil, we were able to integrate sun shading, balconies, canopies, at the same time distinguishing the stores at different areas within its frame. Right, so that's how it came out. So with extreme limitation, right, architecture can still happen. right? Just you just have to be very kind of critical with programmatic requirements. And this is another site where, again, it's sort of a variation of that same idea, right? Building out the mass and creating these uh, spaces that kind of uh, gets inserted within uh, an empty box, distinguishing brands along that facade. Um, okay, we were asked a few years ago by Liberty Group of Companies to make a study for, a 1 hectare parcel of land, which is currently a mall, right? I think it's pure gold, and they wanted to see what would be the most efficient way to use the property, and uh, and it's located on Shaw Boulevard, right? And if you've been to Shaw Boulevard, it's already kind of filled with buildings along the street, where it's a continuous wall of buildings lining the street. And somehow there's this sort of discontinuity between what we build today, in historic urban environments, and the buildings that make up that environment. Many buildings have sprouted over the last 20 years only to isolate neighborhoods, uh, outside its periphery. Reckless developments have built over parks and open spaces, even encroaching on sidewalks and road access. So this is the current condition of the city now, where you can't even see green. You know, and this is the current situation now in Shaw Boulevard, where it's just a relentless row of buildings, sort of lining the street. So this is the site, and adjacent to it is the Archbishop residence, and in the rear of the site is a residential neighborhood, right? So, to get the efficiency of the site, we built out the whole site with a 4 story podium, of retail parking and retail. And it just made sense to kind of take a chunk of this mass in the middle and create a park where it could act as an urban relief, along Shaw Boulevard, right? Where you can actually drop off and also use it for access to the site. And dropping a park on top of the roof, and terracing it down along the periphery, and also where that middle park was, sort of made the site sort of stitch the surrounding neighborhoods around it, because you'd be able to access a park, from all sides of the property. And the office and residential towers sort of emerge from the cutout craters where you'd be able to walk, tenants would be able to walk from one building to the other without intersecting vehicular circulation or public or the public zone. And that's how. Yeah. And the next project is a site for the Sacred Heart Diocese in Bel Air. Father Apacible was the head of the parish there, and he's a good friend of my father. So he wanted some studies made of that site. So I kind of volunteered. They needed help. So the project was to build an office, a columbarium, and a theater right on the site. So this is the current site now. There's a park. Actually a park in front of this church, and it's being used now as a parking lot, and it's also gated, right? And so what I did was to move the parking into the basement to free up, the park, and place the two buildings, the office and the columbarium, sort of framing the site. The 8-story building being sort of blocking the main road behind it, and placing the columbarium in between the church and the 8-story building. So creating a sort of a nice frame for the columbarium. It's also a nice approach to the columbarium. Okay. So the columbarium itself is an open courtyard, and we actually enclosed a tree, which is existing in that site, and accessing all the floors of that columbarium was a series of ramps. So there was no need to go through stairs, but it was just access through these ramps and an elevator, right, with a chapel on the ground floor. And being cladded with onyx, the columbarium became sort of the only source of light, the dominant light in that park. Okay. Well, the Surrender Bridge, we kind of did it a few years back. Ayala Land came up to me and said, "Can you design a bridge?" Even if I had no experience in making a bridge. I guess if you give it to an engineer, it would turn out different, right? So they kind of trust an architect to do a bridge. So, and we had to hire, a bridge designer. They called a few guys in Arup, and apparently one of the best bridge designers from Arup, who was staying in London, flew in, and gave us some pointers of how to make a bridge, right? So I can design a bridge now. So as bridges or pedestrian bridges, they end up, if you go through EDSA, you have two vertical circulations on either end, which is accessed either by elevator, stair, or escalator. right? And it's spanned through a series of box trusses. So what we did was, to eliminate the two ends, the two vertical axes, by bending the bridge platform, right? So that you'd be able to ramp, uh, at the end of the bridge instead of going down the steps, and forming the top chord of the beam, so that, to create sort of a new spatial experience through the bridge, narrowing from one end and opening to the other end. And cladding it with glass panels. Actually, in the beginning, we wanted to activate the glass panels with sensors, so that when you go through the bridge, different light panels along the bridge would light up, to create sort of an installation, a light installation as you pass through the bridge, and you're able to see that on the street. But with budget constraints, we weren't able to do it. I mean, just as an info, the designer of the bridge, I mean, they ended up not getting the Arab designer. But apparently, he was charging a 60 million design fee to design this bridge, okay, which is the actual cost of the bridge, okay? So it was, they let me do it instead, yeah. And that's existing bridge now. Working sometimes with developers are a bit challenging, especially working with the contractors of developers. So, it's almost taxing, stressful, talking to these people, because, all you want is to just make a decent, nicely put together bridge, right? But somehow we're just plagued with unskilled labor, and you all have to deal with that, right? And developers always tend to, I mean, if you think the way they think, right? They want to maximize, the land, maximize the FAR. So this building, actually one of my first buildings after St. Benilde, was actually commissioned by my uncle, where Lor Calma has his office. So being a very, incredible businessman, engineer, so he asked me to maximize the massing of this building. So the only thing that I could do is actually make the facade, right? So this building was actually inspired from our traditional craft of making objects, from parts of natural materials or waste materials. So what I did was to just with a single shaped trapezoidal panel, aluminum panel, rotating it, flipping it, you can actually produce a very interesting facade, right? This being a sunscreen, and making it, making it a kind of ideogram, like a character, which is the image of the building. So, we can still work with developers. And a few years later, MDC, who is the contractor of Ayala Land, uh, called me. They wanted to do a building in Larca. After, bashing them a few years back, right? So they called me again. But somehow the site is a bit difficult, because it's a site where two roads converge to a point. So it was quite difficult to kind of lay out or have this traditional idea of a typical center core, uh, you know, apply to the current floor plate, right? You won't be able to get an efficient floor plate, right? I mean, actually, they told me that they've been working at this thing for a long time, the in-house engineers and the architects, and they just couldn't figure it out. How can you make it efficient, right? But they were just looking at it in a very, different way. I mean, they always impose that, okay, all towers should have a center core, a center vertical core, right? But you don't need it. You don't need that. Um, so what I did was to put the core, the two vertical cores, on either end, right? Freeing up that floor plate in the middle, allowing, maximum flexibility on that space, horizontally or vertically. And having 5 departments in that building, we were able to make changes, without making the efficiency suffer, right? They've been moving the departments all year round, finding the perfect arrangement for all these departments to work, right? And there was no problem. So after finally pinning down the location of the departments, we wanted to express each department on the facade, right? By sort of twisting and skewing those departments and making it the facade itself, right? So that's how it turns out. Okay, so finally, after a long wait, the government finally approved the budget for a Balair Airport. This was actually, I shouldn't even be showing this to you because it's actually just, just recently awarded, right? So, but it's it was spearheaded by the late Senator Angara, maybe 5-6 years ago, to put a new airport in Balair, right? And I had worked with like government projects before, so often these projects have always been plagued by unskilled labor. I mean, if you look at the airports now, you can't argue, right? I mean, just looking at the bathrooms in our airports, that shows, we don't know how to make bathrooms, just simple bathrooms. So knowing that how government works. So before designing the airport, I identified simple and familiar building systems, right, which can be executed by specialty contractors, that could be assembled by skilled labor by those specialty contractors on site with pre-finished parts, right? So that's the site. So the roof being the dominant element here, and using a conventional standing seam metal roof, which is used in factories. Yeah? And I had experience with it when I was doing the Mine Museum, which is it's a malleable roof system. Uh, you can actually deform it. No? So we deformed it, articulated the arrival and departure entry by simply deforming those edges. And it also created a spatial hierarchy in the interior, to define the departure area, lounge, and the arrival hall. And underneath, this huge roof are all the, utilities and all the other requirements of an airport. So this is the entry, departure. And this is arrival, the arrival hall. And Baler is actually located sort of encompassed by the Sierra Madre Mountains, right? So, there are a lot of woods that you can gather from the mountains because lightning always hits the forest, almost every day, right? So there's a ton of fallen trees, which Senator Angara collects, and he has a huge warehouse where all these logs are kept. And we wanted to use those, to line some of the walls of the interior of the airport, just to kind of localize, the airport, not pretentiously, creating a metaphor, that, taking a sort of an element from, the province of Baler and kind of associating it with the form. But we kept this thing very objective, very sort of dry, no metaphor, right? But I'm sure the tourists, when they come, would be able to relate, the roofing, the interior, with, the elements that make up Baler. The mountain profiles and the surfing. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
All right, thank you once again to Mr. Ed Calma. Yes. So we will be now opening the question